I assume a lot of times that when I start talking about these cars that everybody knows what I'm talking about. So this is a Chevrolet El Camino, and it was a car that was actually, I think, on a Malibu or Chevelle frame body, and they kept the two front seats and then put a bed on it like a pickup. And far back as I can remember, about 1957, my dad had a forged version, which was a Ranchero. And they ran these cars for a long time. They were kind of supposedly a city pickup, but that was back when driving a pickup wasn't a whole lot of fun like it is now, and certainly not as comfortable. So they gave guys that maybe, like my dad had a hardware store and he'd make small deliveries, and it was a little more comfortable to ride in than the pickup that he had. So here you go with an El Camino. This belonged to, I think, Dad, and has been passed down to son, who's probably, older, and he wants to get some things fixed on it. So the first thing we did, this still has an air conditioning system that uses Freon from George Bush Sr.'s presidency, which was the early 90s, if you remember him, some of you younger guys. And in his presidency, they decided that the world was going to evaporate if we didn't do something to close up the hole in the ozone layer. They told us we're all going to die. So one of the things that they did to fix that, and by the way, the hole's still there if the internet's correct, they banned R12 Freon and phased it out and replaced it with R134A. Well, this Freon is really non-existent now because they're not allowed to make any more of it, but somehow people still find a way to come up with some of it. Some of it's propane based as a propellant, and I think the propellant was what was in their opinion a bad deal. So this car is still on R12, old Freon, and it still has, and I hope that Lisa could get some pictures, because it still has clamps on the hoses, which was a thing that was done back then, not done today. Everything's crimped, and they had a special clamp they used to join the air conditioning lines up as they installed or worked on the air conditioning. And so I kind of didn't want to do this, but the fella showed up with a bottle of his own Freon, and I told him we'd put it in there. We didn't even know if there was Freon in the bottle. Turns out that there was, and it works great so far. We haven't had it sit here long enough to see if there's any leaks, but currently it's working. So hooray for the R12 old El Camino that has an air conditioner in it that's still original. We'll see how well that works and if it'll stay working through the weekend when we get back. So now for you guys that want to understand parts, this is the air conditioning compressor right here. That's a pump. It pumps the Freon through the system just like your outdoor unit at home. And one of the things that fails on these is this clutch right here. And that's what engages the belt. So when you turn on the air conditioning, this wire right here creates a magnet and sucks in this pulley, if you will, and then starts engaging the belt where it turns the compressor. So you can see right now, as I'm turning that's turning the compressor, but it's not engaging the belt. If this was on, you wouldn't be able to turn this. So one of the things that we do if you have an air conditioning issue on your car is turn it off, and of course wait till it cools off. And if you can turn this, that means then that the compressor is probably not locked up. Doesn't necessarily mean it's working, but one of the problems that was associated with these old compressors was they locked up. They basically wore out and locked up and wouldn't turn anymore. And a lot of times you'd turn them on and the belt would squeal real loud, so you knew immediately that was the problem. So this is such an early system, it doesn't even have what we call a cycling switch, which tells the compressor, hey, it's so cold inside you can shut off for a while. That switch is non-existent on this. That's how early this is. Later on, they called them low pressure switches, but that was something that wasn't even available back when this car was produced. And then this is what's called a throttle suctioning valve, which is the low side. There's a high side and a low side to the air conditioning. So the high side is the side that comes out of the compressor, and it's usually a smaller line, and that side goes inside the car. So you can see that we are coming out, and excuse me, it comes off of the compressor, goes to the condenser, and then comes out of the evaporator, and here's where we go into the car, right here. So I got a little, my fingers got all mixed up. So the high side goes in, and there's a restriction in there that creates a pressure differential that makes Freon get really cold, and then it comes out this side through what's called a throttle suctioning valve. These were really a bad part, and they got rid of those too. But this is a throttle suctioning valve. They had a couple of names for them. They'd stick. And one of the things that we'd do if it wasn't working right was we'd take a hammer and do this to try to get this thing loosened up, because over the winter time it wasn't running, and then you turn it back on and this would stick and your air conditioner wouldn't work. So back then you could buy those parts. Now you can't buy them. There's a conversion for this. If you guys got this on your car at any of the places, like we use Old Air in Fort Worth, that has parts to alleviate that old worn out part. Down here is the expansion valve, and this is the part that actually creates the pressure differential. And it has a capillary tube right here that goes up inside. What a capillary tube does is, as you can see it touches the top here. As it gets so cold in there, it actually freezes up and expands and shuts that valve. Isn't that unique? And that's how that works, so that if it's supposed to keep that from freezing up. A lot of times, like on your car, if this capillary tube is wound up and stuck underneath the car, which a lot of guys did to try to get maximum cooling, it actually doesn't work very well like that because it needs to cycle. So you have to have this capillary tube off this expansion valve right here inside the box where the evaporator is, stuck in the fins of the evaporator, so it can freeze up and shut that off. Actually just restricts the amount of fluid that's going in there till it actually thaws out a little bit. That's something that you have to look at. Now, one way you can tell if that's working is, first of all, these are the hoses that we used back then. Victor cleaned these up. I thought it'd be kind of funny to see me look at this all cleaned up. But this is an old set of gauges that you use, and they're old because the connections on the end and the size of the lines are different as they change the Freon. This was called a can tapper right here, and we used to put all our Freon in by buying it by the can, because you could measure how much you put in there. And this was a lot of people call them suicide tappers because nobody used a gauge. They just did this with a line that you bought at a parts store, stuck it on there, and waited until it got cold and then took it off. So these are dangerous. They'll actually blow up and they'll blind you. You're supposed to wear eyewear when you work on this stuff. So anyway, this hooks up to the system, and these two lines go onto the fittings. I'll show you one of those if I'm not out of camera here. This is the high side fitting. That's the pressure side right there. And that's the red line right here. And here's the blue line, and it goes on the low side, and it's on that throttle suctioning valve over there. So then you start filling it up, and you watch these gauges, and you, just like the guy that fixes your air conditioner at your house, there are readings here that are appropriate for a full system. There's also what's called a sight glass on these that you can look at, and it'll have bubbles in it until the system's full. And that is right here on top of the condenser, the dryer. This is what kind of cleans the system. And in here there's a little glass lens, and as you're adding Freon, when that glass lens gets clean, the rule of thumb was add 10% more and you're good. So we filled it up, watched the glass lens, this thing worked. But what I was getting ready to show was that when you have the gauges hooked up, you're going to get a low side pressure and a high side pressure. So if you're doing this at home and you actually have some R12, you want to be around 30 on the low side and around 150 to 200 on the high side on the R12 systems. It's a different set of numbers for the 134 systems. But here's the trick. If it's not working very well, one thing you need to do is shut it off and look at your gauges and see if they equalize, meaning that this reading equals that reading. So if it gets to, say, 60 pounds here, it needs to be 60 pounds there. And what that tells you, if that doesn't happen, is there's something in there restricting the system from leveling out. There's a valve that's stuck, which would like be the throttle suctioning valve. So that's a good, we ran into that with a Thunderbird we were working on here. We were having some trouble making it cool. We shut it off and noticed that it didn't equalize. So we knew immediately that the expansion valve was not doing its job. We replaced it, and that fixed the problem. That was on a brand new system. So you never know what you're going to get into. So if it's not working well, that's a good tip. Make sure it equalizes. Make sure that your pressures are good. If your pressure jumps real high on this side, that's the high side, the pressure side, then that means that there's a restriction on this side. Generally, if there's a restriction on this side, it'll go into a vacuum. So high side is not good. That'll really put your compressor, that's like carrying a sack of cement up 5 flights of stairs. You don't want to do that with the air conditioning system. So make sure this doesn't get too high when you're adding Freon. It also can mean that you put too much Freon in there. So you got to be really careful about that, because that's where it'll show up, right here on the high side. So anyway, this was kind of fun. It brought us back to, after 40 years of doing this, how we used to add Freon to old car systems and fix problems.